thank you to Andrew and Jim for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jen Wood and I'm a microbial community ecologist. So that means that I'm interested in understanding the interactions that occur within microbial communities, so that's between fungi, bacteria, viruses, but also the interactions that occur between these communities and the wider environment. Why? Because I think microbial communities are the foundation of all macro ecosystems. And if we can better understand them, then we can understand how to manipulate them, then we can actually think about engineering ecosystems and communities from the ground up for beneficial processes and products. Now, the thing that makes my research a little bit unique is that I think the best way to understand these communities is by using functional traits. And let me explain what I mean by this. So, the reason functional traits are great is firstly, they allow us to look at the community and see what it's doing. So unlike a traditional microbial taxonomic approach, where we just get a list of names of who's there, functional traits tell us a bit about what the community is doing. And that's because traits can be grouped into different kinds of traits like these, into different kinds of life strategies. So there are traits that relate to competition, traits that relate to stress tolerance, traits that relate to recolonization or rural traits. And this kind of information can tell us a little bit about how community is being shaped by the environment, and with that information we can in turn think about how we might like to shape these communities. So that's one reason. So in addition to giving us some functional information about microbial communities, functional traits also allow us to compare communities even if they have no species in common. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, these two rainforests here, they're clearly from the same kind of biome, but they have nearly no species in common. It's because they're from opposite sides of the world. So if I was to give you the taxonomic lists associated with each of these communities and ask you to draw interesting patterns and conclusions and make a comparison, you'd probably be pretty stuck. Now, that's because these guys are from the opposite side of the world, as I said, but microbial communities can be taxonomically distinct from one end of a paddock to another. So you can imagine if we wanted to try and compare the microbial communities from one type of biome, say a wetland, across a landscape, we might run into trouble pretty quickly. Now, we can get around that problem by using functional traits, and that's because the environment, which dictates the kind of biome we're looking at, doesn't select for species names, but it does select for functional traits. And in fact, that's the reason that you can recognise that both of these are pictures of rainforests. The trees in each photo are exhibiting the same kinds of functional traits. So that's what I do. But what does understanding microbial communities mean for future landscapes? Well, from an agricultural perspective, understanding our soil communities that underpin our ecosystems is probably one of the final frontiers to improving productivity and soil health. And it's not just understanding these communities, but also thinking about using the right sorts of microorganisms. So in my previous research, we've answered this sort of question in a different field, phytoextraction, where we use plants and microbes together to remediate heavy metal contaminated soil. Now in this field, the overarching hypothesis was that the microbes that we add to the system needed to be stress tolerant above all else because there's contaminants in the soil. But when we actually tried to understand the ecology of these communities, we realised that actually this isn't the case. Above all else, these microorganisms needed to have competitive traits. And that's because the plant rhizosphere, which is where we wanted the microorganisms to survive and thrive, was selecting for competitive traits, not stress-tolerant traits. And this was true even in the presence of high levels of heavy metal contaminants. So using this idea of inoculum matching, we can actually start thinking about personalised management practices for different soils, different farms, different communities. Now we can also think about the way our management practices are impacting ecosystems from the ground up. So we've just had Josh Vito finish an honours project with us, where he was able to show that wildfire type burns versus prescribed type burning conditions completely alter the way that microorganisms recolonise a soil after the burn. Now, the question remains, is that going to have flow-on effects for these soils? Is it going to intrinsically change how the nutrient cycling happens? Is that going to have flow-on effects for the ecosystem? Is there going to be a change to the plant-microbe interactions that happen in the soil that might alter the rate and type of seedlings that germinate? We don't know yet. More than this, so with respect to restoration and conservation, if we could understand the traits that typify our rare or, critical biomes, so floodplains, rainforests, peatlands, alpine peatlands, then we can better understand, conserve, manage and monitor these ecosystems. So some of the research we're doing up in the rainforest with peat green is starting to reveal how some of the microbial processes in the soil might actually be creating the diversity that we see in the plant rainforest. And yes, we're only able to make these connections by looking at functional traits, because the communities we're trying to compare were too taxonomically distinct. Forget for a minute our natural ecosystems. Are there any traits that typify a disturbed ecosystem or a managed ecosystem? If we could classify these different kinds of communities, disturbed, natural, managed, maybe we can incorporate that information into our monitoring the success of our restoration programs. Maybe there's some microbial process that we should be incorporating into our restoration programs in a below ground way. So all of these questions and more, many, many more, we can start thinking about if we're considering the microbial communities that underpin our macro ecosystems and indeed future landscapes. So, thank you.
I want everyone to close their eyes. It is 2 a.m. on the 16th of November, 1518. This is what you will be able to see. Now open your eyes. Welcome to 2 a.m. on the 16th of November, 2018, where suddenly the night has been flooded with light. For the last 3.5 billion years, life in Australia evolved to a constant cycle of bright days and dark nights. But in as little as 200 years, we have completely eliminated the dark and effectively turned night into day. But evolution has not had a chance to catch up. This is of particular concern in Australia, where over 80% of our mammals are active at night. Now, I'm sure you can all think of a recent example where it has been unsafe for us to be in the dark, but we need a solution that reduces our impact on the nocturnal environment without compromising our safety. This is the aim of my PhD. The negative effects of light run deep. Many aspects of animal physiology are entrained to light signals, and we, as humans, have developed a landscape with little to no thought about the consequences for those who share our land. Each year we see the passing of the winter solstice, which means spring is around the corner, and with spring comes a flourish of flowers and an explosion of baby animals. You may not have considered that this increase in day length is the main signal for timing birds when food is plentiful. But with urbanisation comes eternal light. For animals, there is no distinction between sun and artificial light. So this change in day length no longer occurs in areas around human settlement. For many animals, this could lead to babies being born at the wrong time of year, when there's not enough food for their survival. Sadly, this is just one of the many ecological consequences animals face when they lose this reliable cue. The introduction of light into the nocturnal environment disrupts the body's internal clock by suppressing the hormone melatonin. The production of melatonin is suppressed by light, with peak production occurring during the dark phase. In this way, melatonin is able to convey information about time of day as well as time of year. What's more, the introduction of energy-efficient white LEDs are increasing these impacts. This is because the peak of these lights occurs in the short blue wavelength region, and these are the wavelengths known to have the greatest suppressive effects on melatonin. However, one benefit of LEDs is the flexibility in spectral composition. Now, to look at this picture, you can see just as much detail under both the white and the orange light. But for many animals, these lights look remarkably different. I am working with lighting engineers to develop wildlife-friendly LED lighting. So far, I've tested these lights on wallabies. I used 3 treatments: a dark control, white LEDs, and long wavelength amber LEDs. I took blood samples at week 0 and again following 10 weeks of night lighting. I then assayed these samples for melatonin, and this is what we found. So we've got our mean melatonin concentration. You can see under our control animals, there was no change in nocturnal melatonin across that 10-week period. This was also reflected in the animals under our long wavelength amber LEDs. And this is in contrast to animals under white LEDs, which showed significant melatonin suppression across that 10-week period. This is a really important result. Over the next few years, I will continue to study the behaviour, health and reproduction of a number of Australian animals to determine the best lighting for our wildlife. While over 500,000 white LEDs have already been installed in Australia, it is not too late. If we look at this light pollution map around Melbourne, compared to Victoria. You can see we don't actually have to go far from major cities to find naturally dark places. Now, this is a trend that remains consistent across Australia. This is in contrast with Europe, which has virtually lost the night sky. This means we still have a chance to influence our future landscapes and reduce the impacts of light pollution by considering 3 simple things: where we light, when we light, and how we light. By considering lighting type, colour, direction and intensity, we can match the best lights with our needs, reducing wasted light, wasted energy and saving money. By taking all this into account, we can develop guidelines for wildlife-friendly lighting so we can turn this sad story around and make a brighter future for us and our native animals.
Okay, thanks for this opportunity. Now, as we've already heard, rural landscapes around the world have been transformed and modified by humans over time. And changes continue today as land uses such as residential development and agriculture increase. Typically, this results in the removal or the modification of native vegetation, which causes challenges for many native wildlife. However, many native species still live within rural landscapes, and therefore we need to think carefully about how to manage these human-dominated systems for biodiversity in the future. Some key questions to consider are therefore what native species of conservation concern remain in rural landscapes? What habitats or attributes of rural landscapes do native species use? And importantly, what is the capacity of rural landscapes to sustain native species populations over time? Now, my research is located in my backyard, which is in the Strzelecki Ranges in Victoria. Now, this is a rural region which has lost more than 80% of its original forest cover. Despite this significant loss of natural habitat though, we found that 46 species of the original forest bird community still remain within the region. Here is an NMDS ordination of the bird community found within each of my study landscapes, which are represented in the triangles. The forest bird community are represented by the green dots, and as you can see by the vectors, native vegetation continues to be the preferred habitat for this forest bird community at the landscape scale. Many species particularly favoured areas where there was remnant forest or eucalypt plantations. And this graph shows you the average richness of forest beds in each of the study landscape types. However, a large proportion, or 85% of this forest bird community also occurred in a wide variety of modified areas where the natural habitat was minimal, on average only less than 10% cover. For example, some forest birds occurred in the agricultural study landscapes, some occurred in the lifestyle property landscapes, and some occurred in the rural townships. Within these modified areas though, we found that there was a big variation in the distribution of individual forest species across the landscape. And here are some graphs comparing the average reporting rate of 2 forest species. So we've got the grey fantail on the left and the eastern whitbird on the right. And as you can see, the grey fantail was widespread and had across the landscape and had a consistent high average reporting rate in all of the different study landscapes. Whereas the eastern whitbird was uncommon and was generally confined to the natural forest landscapes, some plantations and one dairy study landscape that had more than 30% forest cover. Common species such as the grey fantail we found were canopy foragers, and these guys were generalist species in that they used, as well as native vegetation sites, a wide variety of other site types such as crops, pasture, human infrastructure and exotic vegetation. Whereas the eastern whitbird and other uncommon species were ground foragers, and these guys were more specialist in that they only used areas with native vegetation understory. So in summary, habitat transformation and disturbance in rural landscapes is predicted to continue and increase, and we've already heard that today. But these landscapes have an important role to play for conservation in the future. Rural landscapes can be home to species of conservation concern, even where there is limited or transformed native habitat.
It's therefore important to understand the distribution patterns of native species in rural landscapes at both the community and the individual species level, as well as determine which species of conservation concern can remain in these changing areas over time. Native species prefer natural habitat, but where it's absent or limited, some native species will use alternative or substitute habitats, such as gardens and novel ecosystems. A greater understanding and application of the value of modified habitat for biodiversity and native wildlife will be an important tool for conservation in rural landscapes in the future. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'd like to follow on from Kara's talk and talk about bird conservation in fragmented landscapes. And for those of you who are looking at the bird species, I'm going to give the example of the mallee. So if we have a look at the eastern mallee, and this data I'm about to show is from the State of Australia's Birds Report, we see declines in mallee woodland dependent species. So this is from, on the x-axis is 1999, which is the pointer, through to 2013, and you can see there's a big decline during the drought, but after the drought, when it breaks, there's only a partial recovery. And we're talking about species like the Gilbert's whistler, crested bellbird, or chestnut quail thrush. And these are either threatened or near threatened species, so we're used to talking about the decline of these species. However, it's also true, the same pattern for common species. As you can see, there's the baseline peak, and then there's a big decline through the drought and only partial recovery. So these species, like the yellow-plumed honeyeater or spotted pardalote, and I could even have put up the welcome swallow or the magpie lark here. So very common species that we're not expecting to decline are declining. And this is for a range of reasons. It might be for all the drivers you're used to hearing about. It could be fire, or predators, or herbivores, or habitat loss and fragmentation. But I just want to give you an example of one of these species, the mallee emurin, and what is being done to try and rectify the problem. So if we look at the landscape we're talking about, south of the Murray River in the mallee, this is a network of reserves that have multiple wilderness areas in them, very large reserves, some of the biggest in the state, and so we're not used to talking about fragmentation in this system. However, when you look at the aerial image you can see here, you can see that it's actually a network of reserves that are fragmented and sitting in an agricultural matrix. So, and that's all this clearing's actually happened relatively recently in the last century or so, mainly from soldier settlers after the wars. And as a result, this landscape is now in what we would call extinction debt, with declines across a range of species. So despite that, we still have good populations of mallee emurins in Murray Sunset National Park, in Hattah National Park, and in Big Desert. However, in 2014, wildfires wiped them out from Biliat and Narkat, and they haven't been seen in these eastern reserves since the 70s. So at this point, people involved in conservation in the mallee realised the mallee emurin was in a really bad place, because one more bad wildfire season could see the whole species wiped out. So there was an emergency intervention which involved catching birds from Murray Sunset and Hattah and moving them across to Narkat. And that program is just still ongoing, just finished moving birds, and it's looking really promising though, and birds are back in Narkat. And hopefully in 10 years, when that habitat comes back to Biliat, we'll be able to do the same thing there, and then we'll have the landscape repopulated with emurins, which is a really good thing. So this project's been a great success, but it has also been very expensive and a big effort for those involved. And that made me ask the question, can we do this for 10 or 20 species at once? Because that's the numbers of species we're talking about declining in these landscapes. And at least under the current funding environment, that seems like a really long shot for me. So the next question is there another way? So I want to present an alternative approach, which is harnessing the power of refuges that we should consider. So again, we look at this same landscape, and there is some other work I've been doing. I've identified some really important key drought refuges for the mallee emurin, which are in these places in the blue circles. And it's also not just the mallee emurin, it's covering multiple species like the striated grass wren and the red-lord whistler. So these small drought refuges are actually really important for mallee birds. So we could prioritise these areas for management. Seems like a good idea. The other thing I've noticed is that most of these areas have actually been cleared over the last century, because obviously when clearing for farmland you want to preferentially clear the most fertile areas. So I had a look at the GIS layers, and actually what we think of as rare drought refuges were actually, they were over this sort of area. So they were actually once quite common features in the landscape, and not the small isolated spots that we think of today. So once this was the norm. So that provides, I think, an opportunity for future management. We could be looking at revegetating some of these key areas once we've identified them, and then that would have the added benefit of creating connections between reserves at the same time, and hopefully we wouldn't have to have these emergency interventions as often if birds can naturally recolonise after large fires. Thanks.